Conscient Podcast. This is another in the series of the Creative Climate Leadership course. In fact, it's day 5, and I think this will be my last interview of
save best for last, huh?
So I'm with Piro, who lives in Seattle. You'll introduce yourself in a second. Mm-hmm. Just to remind listeners that this podcast is about the how the arts contribute to environmental awareness and action. Often they happen in that order, where the arts can sort of awake people a little bit, but then we need to move and change and adapt to new realities. So why don't you tell us a bit who you are, Em, and then we can jump into a conversation.
Sure, and I'm so glad I made the cut.
Oh, you're welcome.
We've been chatting all week long, and I'm glad to have this chance to kind of go a little bit more deep. So my name's Em. I am from Seattle. I'm from Seattle originally, but I was away for about 15 years, so I've also had a lot of other geographies that have informed how I got where I am today. But today, I live in Seattle and I work for an organization called Sustainable Seattle. I also have a practice. I've been a professional actor, I've been a producer, I've been a creator deviser, and I actually did my graduate coursework in Toronto. So I have a little bit of exposure to the Canadian performance scene as well.
And your practice, how would you describe your art practice?
My art practice specifically?
Yeah.
So my lineage comes from straight theater. So I was trained as an actor. I trained in Seattle and in London. And then I was told formatively from an early teacher that if you want to be an artist, you need to understand the world. And I really took that to heart. So I studied sociology in my undergrad, and I really just delved into what makes people, and kind of the human experience. And my first career was as a social worker. But I kind of started out right away out of school acting as well. So I was acting with kind of small, mid-size equity theaters in the St. Louis area. And I'd always kind of had these dual identities. And one of the other things they say to a lot of artists is that if you can see yourself doing anything else, do that, because this career is so hard to make a living in. But my experience has been that I can't not do either of them. I have to have my social engagement, and I have to have my creative practice and my art. So I've often kind of had to decide between moonlighting one or the other, and sometimes it switches roles, which one's at the top, which one's the daytime, which one's the nighttime. And more what I hope for, what I strive for is a combined practice. And that's why a week like this is such precious space.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get back to the week, but I'd like to have your initial reaction to the question of how do the arts contribute to environmental awareness and action?
Mm-hmm. It's such a good question. I mean, the organization that I work for now is a 30-year-old, presumably environmental nonprofit. I say presumably because I think that sustainability work is more cross-disciplinary than it is specifically environmental. But it certainly falls in that category. And one of my first charges was to look at the things that were thriving within the organization, but also the things where it had opportunity to do more. And as I did my own assessment, my biases aside, and I really do mean that, the arts continued to come forward as a solution as far as how can our work be something that really meaningfully engages? How can it be something that enlivens this conversation that's had so frequently in our community? Seattle considers itself a very environmental and green city. So the arts can really be a way to keep this conversation at the forefront, to facilitate engagement, to go deeper, and to bring audiences together. So one of the things that we experience a lot is that there's a really diverse group of stakeholders in the Seattle area, but they're really segregated. They don't often get to share physical space. So drawing on my lineage and performance, I'm especially interested in what is our responsibility and what are our techniques to create physical spaces where different stakeholders, different groups, different audiences can come together and have a transfer and exchange of ideas, which arts is the mechanism that does that.
Can you think of a specific example of an artwork that would do that would bring people together?
So I tend more towards the social practice side. So I tend to think of the work that I do now as an artwork. It's a practice of bringing community together. So for example, we'll have a summit, an event, a meetup, a lecture, but we hire scenic designers, lighting designers, installation artists, sculptors, to create kind of a threshold. We call it a threshold that people pass through. We want there to be like a substantial shift in space between what's happening outside these doors and what is the precedent that we're setting inside this space. So our gatherings play out a lot like a performance. In addition to that, we partner a lot with the Northwest Film Forum. So they show a lot of films and screenings, and then we're able to host discussions. We're able to have workshops, but I'm most interested in things that are interactive in some way.
You and I have spent this week on this course. Yesterday you were part of a group where we thought it would be a good idea to make a statement coming out of the fact that this is a week when the COVID-19.
Good old COVID.
COVID-19, accelerated around the world.
Yeah.
And it was
Seattle
interesting.
being a home base for that.
Yeah, and other places all around the world.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to me and exciting to see how this group of artists and cultural workers made a statement, and you talked about how the virus itself is symptomatic of the climate change problem that we have in terms of biodiversity and those kinds of things. And we crafted some words, and we thought of many actions that artists could do. So I'm wondering if you want to share some of those thoughts and moments that you found interesting as we sort of struggled with and eventually came to find a way to contribute to that issue.
It just feels like such a serendipitous moment to have been with this cohort of people processing through this. I'm so grateful for what that process that you just described is going to afford me as I go back to my own community, to my staff, to our audiences, to our whole network, to our neighbors, and that I'll kind of have been invigorated and can really be present for them, I think, in a way that they'll need. But for me, some of the things as I was kind of working through this question of like, what does it mean to be essentially creative facilitators in the age of climate change in the midst of a disaster? Some of the things that were really resonant for me were the idea that self-care is community care, that solutions scale up more effectively than they trickle down. And something I've been paying a lot of attention to is the real prime position that we're in to work, especially with Asian Pacific Islander producers and practitioners and neighbors who I think have been disproportionately targeted in this time. And I think we've created these really powerful mechanisms of mutual support that can also be really targeted and engage a broader community kind of through addressing the people who are being the most unfairly kind of attacked in this moment. I think a lot about the idea of what I call slow disaster, fast disaster, no disaster. So slow disasters are things that we see happening. See isn't the right word because they're so ubiquitous. They're around us all the time. They're so omnipresent that sometimes we can't even see them. They're these disasters that are happening all around us. So poverty is a slow disaster. Displacement is a slow disaster. Failings of public health systems are slow disasters. And these feed directly into these episodic climate events like a pandemic, like a hurricane, like an earthquake, and the presence and pressure of a slow disaster directly correlates to the effects of a fast disaster. A lot of the work that we talk about is not only how do we prepare for a fast disaster or curb the effects of a slow disaster, but how do we start to imagine a world with no disaster. And that, I think, is actually the most exciting opportunity for the arts, is this idea of forecasting and imagining not only what can we anticipate will come, what are the trends, but what is our role in shaping that. And I'm also really interested that the more consistently we do that, the more consistently we think about the conditions of that no disaster world, the more capable we are at bringing that to fruition.
Well, there's certainly a number of moments when I felt I'm writing a blog these days about my aha moments. And aha moments are ones that sort of hit you in the gut and say, this is a new idea, or I'm excited about it. And at one point, one of our presenters talked about we're in the post-woke era.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what's that?
Yeah.
Post-woke. Post-awakening. So many people are awakening, and you talked about the slow-moving disasters and the fast ones and the no. So great. People are waking up, but they don't know what to do. They feel disempowered, they feel demoralized, and I was just talking with another of our fellow participants about the necessity to go through grief. And I've certainly felt that myself. There are moments when I'm very discouraged, right? I really don't see a lot of hope. Yeah. And yet, when you get together with a group of artists who have not only a vision of the future, but the imaginative capacity to know that, yes, it will be difficult, but we can, not in a naive way reinvent the world, but they truly can see it, they can feel it, they know where we need to go, and they have some abilities there. So I alternate between pessimism and optimism, and I think that's a kind of a realistic thing. Yeah. How do you feel about that? How do you deal with the dark moments?
It's such a good question, but it's one I think about a lot. Last December, I was working with a colleague in Seattle, and she was doing a facilitation with one of our events, and she had us turn to each other, finding a stranger, someone we didn't know, and just say, what gives you hope? And I was paired with a climate scientist, and she just had this look, and she was like, I can't answer the question. And it was the first time I had been asked that explicitly, and I found myself so able to answer it. And I was just like, I have so much hope, because this is my job. This is the only thing I do, is work in sustainability, disaster preparedness, addressing the climate crisis head on. And my job is to work alongside everyone who is committed to this, and everyone who is innovating, and everyone who is driving change, and everyone who is holding toes to the fire, and everyone who is imagining, and everyone who's panicking and calming each other down. Every single piece of it I see. Our organization also gets a lot of the newcomers, the people who are just showing up like, the world's on fire, what do I do? And we see these like waves of people all the time. We see the commitment, we see the activity, we see the presence, perhaps sometimes to a fault. I mean, I feel like I am so embedded in what feels like this tidal wave of action, and the kinds of solutions and policies and ideas that are coming forward are unprecedented. They are building off of previous successes and failures to fill these gaps and create this vision for a new precedent for our world and our society that I think not only addresses our current crisis, but confronts centuries of these problems. I think we're at the moment we're at now because we've been living on borrowed time. And we can't we're being held to task, and I feel like the world itself is saying like, okay, you have not been able to deal with the violations against other people, other bodies, around your irresponsibility with migration, your irresponsibility with materials and the natural world, your irresponsibility with industry, your disregard of other people's basic rights. And so you better do it, or else, we're being held to task. And I think the vision, so that actually gives me hope. I feel like the only way that we'll come out of this is through a tremendous movement of justice. And it makes me so excited about the world that's on the other side of this. You know, it's not only going to be a climate secure world, it's going to be a world of, I think, a level of justice and liberation like we have never seen as complex societies.
I agree with you that potential is there, and sometimes the terms we use, like sustainable, it sounds like it's a compromise. It sounds like, well, we'll have to have one car instead of two. No, you have to rethink transportation.
Entirely.
You have to reinvent culture. Well, maybe we can actually not so much reinvent as go back to traditional cultures that worked really well, that were
or blend, you know, find new, I think, combined spaces or integrated spaces that are kind of a new precedent for how different cultures engage with each other.
So to end, Em, I would like to know if you have any advice for I assume you're a millennial of some kind.
I think I'm called a zenennial or something. Yeah, I'm like older than the 20-something millennials, but I'm not a Gen Xer. I'm right in between.
Right. Any thoughts, advice for fellow artists? Because in fact, you're not just an artist, because you're a sustainability worker. And Marta Curran was just here, and she talks about a new worker called a sustainablist or
I heard her say that. Yeah,
and it's nice to think that new sectors, new disciplines, new ways of working will come up. So, do you have any advice for your fellow artists / social worker, sustainable, in terms of what they should do or think about to move forward in their work?
That's such a great question. The first thing that comes up for me is our instincts are strong. And I think in being an artist in the kind of predominant social and economic structure we have set up sometimes is to feel like a square peg in a round world. But actually that square peg is a piece of a new paradigm. And so the intrinsic way of being, the thing I think that just makes artists at their core, I'm sure you've talked to Andrew as well, and this is like the fundamental to his research, that has tremendous merit and is valid in and of itself. And not only that, I think it's part and parcel to establishing new ways of communicating, being, working together, establishing new visions for industry and economics and society and things like that. The other thing that I want to say is that, just because you made me think of it, you brought up the S word, sustainability. And talking about how that kind of implies maybe a status quo. And, sometimes people have talked about, it's not sustainability, it's resilience. Oh, it's not resilience, it's regenerative. The word that I have settled into, every jargon word, I don't know, we can words matter, yes, of course, but also let's stop talking about the word and just start making sentences. That said, the word that I have really settled on and that has become a really tenant word for my life is simply generative. I like that it's a word that implies not only regenerating, but making new things together, making new things cross-culturally, cross-disciplinarily, and in partnership and collaboration with our natural world.
Well, let's leave it at that, because whether we generate or regenerate, there's a lot of work to do. And
it's true.
We have certainly the capacity in our imagination and in our creative work to see ourselves not just through the crises, but a much better world. And I feel it's important to talk, to walk our talk, and once in a while to rest.
Yes.
In order to be able to sustain, and in this case, I think sustain word is our efforts, our collective efforts to move things forward. Anyway, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have met you and to have this time with you.
À la prochaine.